Alexander Whitmore threw the plain black dress onto the bed like it was trash and looked his wife dead in the eyes. "Wear this tonight, and for God's sake, don't open your mouth. You embarrass me every time you speak." Victoria Hayes stood perfectly still, holding 5 years of silence in her chest. He didn't even wait for an answer. He turned and walked out, already forgetting she existed. But something in her had just gone quiet in a way that was not surrender. It was the quiet before a storm. Before we go on, if you believe a person's worth should never depend on someone else's opinion of them, take 1 second and subscribe to this channel. Follow Victoria's story all the way to the end, because the ending will stay with you. And leave a comment telling me the city where you're watching from right now, so I can see just how far this story travels tonight. For 5 years, everyone in New York believed they knew exactly who Victoria Hayes was. She was the wife, the quiet one, the beautiful woman who stood 2 steps behind the great Alexander Whitmore at every gala, every ribbon cutting, every magazine photograph. She smiled when she was told to smile. She stepped forward when the cameras wanted a family portrait, and she stepped back the moment the flashing stopped. People assumed she was simple. They assumed she was lucky. A woman who had married into money and had nothing to offer but her looks and her patience. That was the story Alexander had built, and Alexander was very, very good at building stories. To the world, he was a genius, the founder of Whitmore Holdings, a man who had turned a single loan and a rented office into a billion-dollar empire through sheer confidence and ambition. Reporters loved him, investors trusted him, and in every room he entered, people leaned toward him like he was the only source of heat in winter. But inside their Manhattan penthouse, 40 floors above the city that worshipped him, Alexander was a different man entirely. There, Victoria was not a partner. She was furniture. She cooked for his private dinners. She managed his household staff. She memorized the names of every investor's wife so that Alexander would never be embarrassed at a party. She organized his charity events down to the color of the napkins, and then she watched him take the microphone and thank everyone except her. Behind every great man, people like to say laughing. Victoria had stopped laughing at that a long time ago. One evening, months before the gala that would change everything, she stood in the kitchen preparing a dinner for 8 of his top executives. Alexander walked in, loosening his tie, checking his phone, not looking at her. "The Hendersons are coming too," he said, "so make it 9. And Victoria, when they ask you about the business, just smile and say you leave all that to me. Understand, I don't need you confusing anyone." She set down the knife slowly. "I wasn't going to talk about the business, Alexander." "Good, because you don't understand it." He said it the way another man might comment on the weather. No cruelty in his voice, just certainty. And that certainty was worse than any shout. "You'd be surprised what I understand," she said quietly. He finally looked up, and for 1 second something flickered across his face. Not curiosity, irritation. "Don't start," he said. "Not tonight." And that was the end of it. She smiled through that dinner. She refilled glasses and laughed at jokes that weren't funny and complimented the executives' wives on their handbags. And she watched her husband explain a supply chain problem to the entire table, getting it completely wrong, and she said nothing at all. Because Victoria Hayes had a secret so large that if it ever came out, it would swallow the entire room whole. Years before she ever met Alexander Whitmore, before she became a name on his tax documents, she had already been a legend. Not in New York, in Europe, and not under her own name, under 2 letters, VH. Behind those 2 letters was a design house that had quietly reshaped the luxury world. Fashion, product design, branding for houses so old and so proud that they never admitted they needed help. But they did need help, and they came to VH, and they paid fortunes for it, and they signed contracts promising never to reveal who VH actually was. Victoria had built that anonymity on purpose. She had watched brilliant women get eaten alive the moment they became visible, picked apart for their faces, their voices, their age, their marriages. So she made herself a ghost. She let the work speak. And the work had made her rich long before she ever heard the name Whitmore. When she met Alexander, she was already worth more than he was. He never knew. That was the part that would one day break him. Because when Alexander Whitmore fell in love with Victoria Hayes, he wasn't falling in love with a powerful woman. In his mind, he was rescuing a quiet, ordinary beauty from an ordinary life, and Victoria, God help her, had let him believe it. She had asked herself 1,000 times since then why she did that, why she hid the biggest part of herself from the man she married. The honest answer frightened her. She hid it because she wanted to be loved for the small human parts of herself, the way she laughed, the way she remembered his coffee order, the way she stayed up talking with him at 2 a.m. in the early days, back when he still asked what she thought and actually waited for the answer. She had wanted a husband who loved the woman, not the empire, so she had shown him only the woman, and she had prayed that would be enough. It had not been enough. Because a man who cannot see the fortune standing right in front of him is a man who was never really looking at all. The changes had come slowly. That was how these things always happened, she would later tell a room full of strangers. Never all at once, just a series of small doors closing one after another, so gently that you don't hear the locks click until you're already sealed inside. First, he stopped asking her opinion. Then he stopped introducing her by anything but her title. My wife. Never her name, as if her name were classified information. Then came Olivia Carter. Olivia was Alexander's new public relations director, hired 18 months before the gala. She was sharp and glossy and always 3 steps ahead, and she had a talent for standing exactly where a wife should stand. At events, it was Olivia who leaned in to murmur strategy in Alexander's ear. Olivia who traveled with him. Olivia who understood the business, or at least performed understanding it convincingly enough that no one questioned her. Victoria noticed the way Olivia looked at her. It wasn't hatred. Hatred would have been easier. It was dismissal. The look you give a piece of old furniture you're planning to replace. One afternoon, Victoria came home early and heard them in Alexander's study, the door half open. You need to be careful with Victoria at the gala, Olivia was saying. She's fragile. If she panics in front of Blackwell, it could cost us everything. She won't, Alexander said. She knows her place. Victoria stood in the hallway, her heart pounding, and waited to feel humiliated. She waited for the tears. They didn't come. Instead, something colder arrived, something clear. She knows her place. She walked to her closet that night and stood in front of the black dress he'd chosen for her. And for the first time in 5 years, Victoria Hayes asked herself a dangerous question. What if she stopped protecting him? The gala Alexander was building toward was not just another party. It was the most important night of his life, and Victoria knew it, even though he'd never explained it to her directly. She had learned to read her husband the way sailors learn to read the sky. Whitmore Holdings was in trouble. She had seen the signs for months. The late-night phone calls that ended the moment she entered the room, the lawyers coming and going, the way Alexander had started drinking 2 scotches before dinner instead of 1. His empire, the one the whole world admired, was cracking somewhere underneath the marble, and the man who could save it or bury it was a billionaire named Richard Blackwell. Blackwell was old money layered on top of new. He had turned 3 separate industries upside down in his lifetime, and he had a reputation for 2 things. He never lost, and he could not be flattered. Charm bounced off Richard Blackwell like rain off stone. He invested in substance and substance only. Alexander was terrified of him and pretending not to be, and Victoria could see both things at once. Blackwell is going to save this company, she overheard him tell Olivia one night. The gala is the whole game. If I land him, we're untouchable. If I don't, we're finished. So everything has to be perfect. Everything. Everything has to be perfect. Victoria almost laughed at that, because Alexander's idea of a perfect night included her wearing a forgettable black dress and keeping her mouth shut in front of the one man in America who might actually recognize the 2 letters VH. He had no idea. He had married one of the most respected minds in the luxury world, and he was about to parade her in front of the only guest who could name her while ordering her to disappear. The universe, Victoria thought, had a sense of humor after all. The morning of the gala, the penthouse was chaos, florists, caterers, security. Alexander moved through it all like a general barking corrections, ignoring his wife entirely except once when he passed her in the hallway and stopped. You have the dress, he asked. I have it. Good. He looked her up and down, and there was no warmth in it, only inspection. You'll be fine tonight as long as you remember 2 things. Smile and stay quiet. Can you do that for me? 5 years earlier, that question would have wounded her. Now she looked at him with a calm that should have frightened him if he'd been paying attention. I can do exactly what tonight requires, she said. He nodded, satisfied, and walked away, hearing agreement in a sentence that had promised him nothing at all. Later that afternoon, Victoria sat alone in her dressing room and looked at the black dress hanging on the door. Plain, shapeless, chosen specifically to make her vanish. Then she opened the second closet, the one Alexander never looked in because he assumed it was full of his wife's boring things. Inside, wrapped in white cloth, was a gown. She had made it herself. Emerald green, the color of deep water, cut with a precision that only VH could achieve, because VH had spent decades learning exactly how fabric could turn a woman into a force of nature. She had designed it months ago, telling herself it was just an exercise, just a way to keep her hands busy while her marriage rotted around her. But she had known. Some part of her had always known she was building armor. Victoria ran her fingers over the fabric and let herself remember who she used to be. Not the wife, not the decoration. The woman whose sketches had made grown men in Milan weep. The woman investors had chased across 3 continents. The woman who had before all of this been enough. She thought about the phone call she'd received 2 weeks earlier. A private call on a number almost no one had. "Ms. VH," the voice had said, warm and careful. "My name is Richard Blackwell. Forgive the intrusion. I've spent the better part of a year trying to find the person behind your work. I have a proposal that I think will interest you. But more than that, I simply want to shake the hand of the genius who's been hiding for so long." Victoria had gone very still on that call, because Richard Blackwell was the same investor her husband was preparing to court at the gala. The same man. And neither man knew that the other one was chasing the very same woman from opposite directions for opposite reasons. Alexander was chasing Blackwell to save himself. Blackwell was chasing VH because he'd already realized she was worth more than any company in that ballroom. And VH was Victoria, the wife, the furniture, the one told to stay quiet. She had not told Alexander about the call. She had not told anyone. Instead, she had said to Blackwell in that careful voice she used with people who mattered, "I'll be at the Whitmore Foundation Gala. Perhaps we'll meet there." There had been a pause, a soft, knowing pause. "The Whitmore Gala," Blackwell had repeated slowly. "How interesting. I'll look forward to it, Ms. VH, very much." And that was all. Now, sitting in her dressing room with 2 dresses in front of her, Victoria understood that she was standing at a border. On one side was the woman she had been for 5 years, the invisible one, the one who protected a man who despised her strength. On the other side was someone she had buried alive to keep a marriage that had already died without telling her. She thought about all the dinners, all the smiles, all the times she had swallowed the answer that would have saved him from looking like a fool, because looking foolish would have hurt his pride, and his pride had always mattered more than her voice. "Just smile and stay quiet." She stood up. "No," she said out loud to an empty room. "Not tonight." There was a knock at the door. Her assistant, a young woman named Grace, who was the only person in that entire household who saw Victoria as a full human being, stepped inside. "They're leaving for the venue in an hour, Mrs. Whitmore," Grace said. Then she saw the emerald gown and her breath caught. Oh my, is that yours?" "I made it," Victoria said quietly. Grace stepped closer, her eyes wide. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It looks like something out of a museum. Mrs. Whitmore, this is a VH piece. I'd know that work anywhere. My sister saved for 2 years to buy a VH scarf." She stopped realizing what she'd said, and her face went pale with confusion. "Wait, how do you have a VH gown? These don't exist for sale. There's no VH couture line. There never has been." Victoria looked at the young woman for a long moment. 5 years of silence pressed against the back of her teeth. "Grace," she said gently, "can you keep a secret?" Grace nodded slowly. "There's no VH couture line," Victoria said, "because VH never made one. She only ever made one gown, this one, and she made it for herself." Grace's hand rose to her mouth. Understanding crashed over her all at once, and her eyes filled with tears. "It's you," she whispered. "All this time. It's you. And he treats you like..." She couldn't finish. "He treats me like nothing," Victoria said softly, "because I let him. Because I thought love meant making myself smaller, so he could feel large." She reached out and touched the emerald fabric one last time. "I was wrong, Grace. I was wrong for a very long time, but I'm done being wrong." Grace wiped her eyes, and something fierce came into her young face. "What do you need me to do?" Victoria smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a real smile, the smile of a woman waking up. "Help me get dressed," she said. "The real me. And Grace." When we walk out that door tonight, whatever happens, whatever he says, do not let me shrink. Not 1 inch. Grace nodded hard. Not 1 inch, Mrs. Whitmore. I promise. Downstairs, Alexander was pacing by the private elevator, checking his watch, rehearsing his pitch under his breath. Olivia stood beside him in a silver dress, scrolling through the guest list on her phone. Blackwell confirmed 20 minutes ago, Olivia said. He's coming. This is it, Alexander. Everything you've worked for. I know what it is, Alexander snapped, then softer, catching himself. Where is she? Your wife. Olivia's mouth curved slightly. Getting ready, I assume. Don't worry about her. She'll do what she always does. Stand there and look pretty and stay out of the way. She paused, then added with the casual cruelty of someone who has decided a person doesn't matter. You should really think about the optics after tonight, Alexander. A man of your stature. People notice when a wife has nothing to contribute. Blackwell will notice. Alexander said nothing, but he didn't disagree either, and that silence was its own kind of answer. Everyone here knows who really helps you build this empire, Olivia added quietly, stepping just a little closer. Everyone knows. He almost smiled. He didn't correct her. Upstairs, Victoria heard none of this, but she didn't need to hear it. She had felt it in the air of that penthouse for 18 months. The slow, patient replacement of a wife by a woman who understood what Victoria had understood long ago, that Alexander Whitmore did not value people. He valued usefulness, and the moment you stopped being useful to his image, you became invisible. Grace zipped the emerald gown and stepped back, and both women looked into the mirror. The woman who looked back was not the quiet wife. Her spine was straight, her chin was level, her eyes, which had spent 5 years lowered, were lifted and steady and clear. She looked, Grace thought, like the founder of something, like the head of an empire that answered to no one. There she is, Victoria whispered to her own reflection. There you are. I've missed you. Mrs. Whitmore, Grace said carefully. He's going to be furious. Yes, Victoria said. He is. He's going to try to send you back up here to change, in front of everyone. I know. What are you going to do? Victoria turned from the mirror, and there was no fear in her at all. Only a strange floating calm, the kind that comes when a person has finally stopped negotiating with someone who is never going to be fair. I'm going to do exactly what he asked me to do, she said. I'm going to walk into that ballroom and make sure that tonight is unforgettable. She picked up a small emerald clutch. He wanted everyone to remember this night, Grace. He just didn't understand which part they'd remember. The elevator doors opened downstairs, and Alexander looked up, ready to inspect his obedient wife in her forgettable black dress, ready to give her one last warning to stay quiet. But the elevator was empty. He frowned. Where is she? Coming down in the second car, sir, a member of the staff said. She said she wanted to arrive separately. Alexander's jaw tightened. That wasn't the plan. Victoria never deviated from the plan. She didn't have the spine for it. Fine, he muttered, though it was not fine, and something cold began to crawl up the back of his neck. Let's go. Blackwell doesn't wait for anyone, and neither do I. He stepped into the elevator with Olivia, and as the doors slid closed, he had no idea that his entire life had just left the building 40 floors above him, dressed in emerald green, carrying a secret that would end him. The gala had already begun by the time the second car pulled up to the venue. Inside, the great and the golden of American society moved beneath light like a slow tide of wealth, old fortunes and new ones, names from the newspapers, faces from the magazines. And moving among them, Alexander Whitmore worked the room with a smile stretched tight over his fear-shaking hands, laughing at jokes, searching every doorway for the arrival of Richard Blackwell. Blackwell had not yet appeared, but Alexander's wife was about to. At the far end of this room near the entrance, a small commotion began, a murmur, a turning of heads, the particular ripple that moves through a crowd when something unexpected walks in. Who is that? A woman in diamonds whispered to her husband. I have no idea, he murmured back. But my God. The whispers spread outward like rings in water, gathering until they reached the center of the room where Alexander stood. Do you see her? That gown. I've never seen anything like it. Is that a VH piece? It can't be. He doesn't do couture. That woman looks like she owns the world. Alexander turned toward the entrance, annoyed by the distraction, ready to find his wife and get her safely tucked into a corner. And then he saw her. For one full second, Alexander Whitmore did not recognize his own wife. He saw a woman in emerald green standing in the doorway of his most important night, and every eye in that ballroom was pulled toward her the way iron is pulled toward a magnet. She was luminous. She was certain. She stood like she had built the room and was deciding whether to let them all stay. Then recognition hit him, and the blood drained from his face. Victoria, his invisible wife, the furniture, the one he'd told to disappear. She was the most powerful presence in the entire room, and she hadn't said a single word. Olivia appeared at his elbow, her voice sharp and low. "Alexander, what is she wearing? That is not the dress. What is she doing?" But Alexander couldn't answer. His mouth had gone dry, because he was watching the faces of his guests, the billionaires and the tastemakers, and the people whose opinions decided fortunes, and he was watching them all look at his wife the way they had never once looked at him, with awe. Victoria walked into the room slowly, and she did not go to her husband. That was the first thing everyone noticed. A wife enters and finds her husband, but this woman entered like a head of state, greeting no one and everyone, letting the crowd part around her. Alexander recovered enough to move. He crossed the room fast, his smile welded on for the benefit of the watching crowd, and he reached her and took her arm, and under his breath, so no one could hear, he hissed, "What are you wearing? I told you to wear the black dress. I told you not to make yourself noticeable." Victoria looked at his hand on her arm. Then she looked at his face, and she smiled, calm and unbothered, a smile for the cameras and a warning for him. "For once, Alexander," she said quietly, "I wanted to be seen." "You look ridiculous," he whispered furiously. "You're embarrassing yourself. Everyone's staring." "Yes," she agreed. "They are. Go home and change, now, before Blackwell gets here." And there it was, the name, Blackwell, the whole reason for the night. Alexander said it like a threat, like the arrival of the one man who mattered was a reason for his wife to hide even harder. Victoria felt something inside her go very still and very sure. "No," she said. Alexander blinked. In 5 years, he could not remember her ever saying that word to him. Not once. "What did you say?" "I said no." Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. "I'm not going home. I'm not going to change. And I'm not going to stand quietly in a corner while you pretend I don't exist. Not tonight, Alexander. Tonight I'm going to be exactly who I am." His face twisted. "And who do you think you are?" She looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes was 5 years of swallowed answers, 5 years of dimmed light, 5 years of a woman making herself small so a small man could feel tall. "You're about to find out," she said. "You and everyone in this room." Before he could respond, a member of the staff approached wide-eyed. "Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Blackwell has arrived. He's asking to be introduced to someone specific. He says he's been trying to meet this person for over a year." Alexander's fear evaporated into triumph. This was it. Blackwell was here, and Blackwell wanted an introduction. His whole future was about to be secured. "Of course," Alexander said smoothly, straightening his jacket, forgetting his wife entirely. "Take me to him. Who does he want to meet?" The staff member glanced at a card in his hand, confused. "He didn't give a full name, sir. Just initials." He looked up. "He's asking to be introduced to someone called VH. The color left Alexander's face for the second time that night. VH. I knew those letters. Everyone in the luxury world knew those letters. The ghost designer, the invisible genius, the most valuable anonymous name in the entire industry. "VH isn't here," Alexander said quickly. "There must be a mistake. Nobody knows who that even is. It's a myth, a marketing rumor." "Mr. Blackwell seems very certain, sir," the staff member said. "He says VH confirmed she'd be attending this gala. Tonight." Alexander turned slowly toward his wife, a terrible question forming in his eyes, a question he did not want to ask because he already sensed the answer, and the answer was going to destroy him. Victoria stood there in emerald green calm, as still water, and she watched the understanding begin to crawl across her husband's face like a crack spreading through glass. "Victoria," he said, and his voice had changed completely. The command was gone. The contempt was gone. Something small and afraid had taken their place. "Victoria, what is he talking about?" She held his gaze. She let the silence stretch, 5 years of silence, all of it gathering into this single moment. "I told you," she said softly. "For once I wanted to be seen." And across the ballroom, cutting through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been ignored in his life, Richard Blackwell was walking straight toward Victoria Hayes, his hand already extended, his eyes bright with recognition, his voice ready to say the words that would tear Alexander Whitmore's carefully built world down to its foundations. Alexander opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in his life, the great Alexander Whitmore had absolutely nothing to say, and the woman he had treated like nothing was about to become the only person in the room who mattered. Richard Blackwell crossed that ballroom like a man walking toward the one thing he'd been searching for his entire life, and he did not stop until he was standing directly in front of Victoria Hayes. Alexander tried to step between them. It was instinct, the reflex of a man who had spent his whole life standing in front of things, taking the center, absorbing the attention meant for others. He put out his hand and started the sentence he'd rehearsed 100 times in the mirror. "Mr. Blackwell, it's such an honor. I'm Alexander Whitmore, the founder of Whitmore Holdings, and I've been looking forward to—" Blackwell didn't even look at him. He looked straight past Alexander's outstretched hand, as if it were a coat rack, and he kept his eyes fixed on Victoria, and the whole room felt the snub land. It was small. It was silent. But every powerful person in that ballroom had spent a lifetime reading exactly these kinds of small, silent things, and they all understood at once that something enormous was happening. "You must be VH, Blackwell said warmly, ignoring Alexander completely. "I'd know your work anywhere, and I'd know the person capable of making it the moment she walked into a room. Forgive me. I've waited a very long time for this." He took Victoria's hand in both of his, and he bowed his head slightly, the way men of real power bow only to people they consider their equal. Alexander stood there with his hand still hanging in the air. The whispers around them turned into something else, a low, electric hum. People had put down their drinks, waiters had stopped moving, and Alexander, feeling the floor shift beneath his polished shoes, laughed the nervous laugh of a man trying to reassemble a situation that was falling apart in real time. "I think there's been a mix-up," Alexander said, his voice pitched a little too high. "This is my wife, Victoria. She's not VH. She's not a designer. She doesn't work. VH is some anonymous person. We don't even know if it's real. It's an industry rumor I've heard." "Alexander." Victoria's voice was quiet, but it cut through his babbling like a blade through silk. "Stop." He stopped. He stopped because in 5 years he had never heard her use that tone, and some old animal part of his brain recognized authority when it heard it, even when it was coming from a person he had trained himself to ignore. Victoria turned back to Blackwell, and her whole manner changed. The subject shifted, and suddenly she was fluent in a language Alexander didn't even know existed. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "the honor is mine. I've admired what you did with the Meridian textile houses. Most investors would have stripped them for parts. You understood that the value was in the craftsmen, not the machines. That's rare." Blackwell's eyes lit up like a boy who'd found someone who spoke his native tongue. "You know about Meridian." "I know everything about Meridian," Victoria said simply. "I turned down their commission 4 years ago. They wanted me to modernize the brand, and I told them the brand didn't need modernizing. It needed someone who respected it. It needed you, apparently." Blackwell laughed, delighted, and the sound of that laugh coming from the most feared investor in America made the crowd lean in even further. Alexander's face had gone from white to a mottled red. "This is insane," he said. "Victoria, tell him. Tell him you're not this VH person. Tell him the truth." Victoria looked at her husband, and for the first time all evening, there was something almost like pity in her eyes. "That's exactly what I'm doing, Alexander," she said. "I'm telling him the truth." Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a woman gasped. The word rippled outward. "It's her. It's actually her. That's VH, the wife. His wife. She's VH." Olivia Carter had gone very still. The confidence she wore like a second skin had cracked, and underneath it was something raw and calculating. She was watching her entire strategy, 18 months of patient positioning, collapse in front of her. She stepped forward, trying to salvage something. "Mr. Blackwell," Olivia said smoothly, sliding into her professional voice. "I'm Olivia Carter, Whitmore Holdings Director of Communications. I think what's happening here is a lovely coincidence, but perhaps we could all sit down and who are you?" Blackwell asked, turning to her with polite, devastating disinterest. I run communications for a company I have no intention of investing in. Blackwell finished, and the words dropped into the room like stones into a still pond. The silence after that was total. Alexander made a sound, a small strangled sound, the sound of a man watching his life raft deflate. "You," Alexander started. "You haven't even heard my pitch. That's why I invited you. That's the entire reason for tonight. Mr. Blackwell, my company is on the edge of something extraordinary, and with your capital." "Mr. Whitmore," Blackwell said. And now he did turn to face Alexander fully, and his warmth was gone, replaced by the cold clarity of a man who had built empires by seeing through people. "I've been in this room for 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, I've learned more about the character of a man than most people learn in 4 years. So let me save us both some time." "Richard, please," Alexander said, and the sound of the great Alexander Whitmore saying, "Please," saying it that way, thin and desperate, made several guests actually wince. "You spent this entire evening," Blackwell continued, "trying to sell me on a company, and you were standing next to the single most valuable person in the luxury industry, and you introduced her to me as, and I quote, someone who doesn't work." He shook his head slowly. "A man who can't see the value of his own wife has no business asking me to trust his judgment about anything." The blow landed so hard that people physically stepped back as if the impact might spread. Alexander turned to Victoria, and now his eyes were pleading, and the transformation in him was grotesque to watch this proud man dissolving in real time. "Victoria," he whispered, "help me, please. Say something. Fix this. You know how important tonight is. You know what this means for us. For our future. For our future." Victoria almost laughed. She looked at her husband, at the panic in his face, at the way he was reaching for her now that she was the most important person in the room, now that her value had been announced in front of an audience, and she understood something with perfect aching clarity. I didn't see her even now. Even in this moment, he wasn't looking at Victoria. He was looking at VH. He was looking at the asset. He was calculating how her sudden value might be redirected to save him. "There is no U.S. Alexander," she said quietly. "There hasn't been an U.S. for a very long time. You just didn't notice because you were never really looking at me. You were looking at what I could do for your image." "That's not true," he said, and his voice broke on the lie. "It is true," she said, "and the terrible part is I let you. For 5 years I made myself into exactly the person you wanted. Small, silent, useful, grateful. I buried the best parts of myself in a closet because I thought that's what love required." She shook her head. "I was wrong. That's not love. That's disappearing. And I'm done disappearing." A phone camera flash went off somewhere, then another. The reporters that Alexander had so carefully invited to document his triumph were now documenting his ruin, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Blackwell watched the exchange with the stillness of a man who understood he was witnessing something rare and did not want to interrupt it. But then he did something no one expected. He turned to the crowd, raised his voice, and made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwell said, "since we're all here and since the cat is very much out of the bag, allow me to say publicly what I came here to say privately." The room held its breath. "For the past 14 months, Blackwell said, I have been trying to locate the designer known only as VH. Some of you know the name. Those of you who don't should. VH is responsible for the resurrection of at least 6 major luxury houses across Europe. Houses that were dying. Houses that came back to life because one anonymous genius understood something the rest of the industry had forgotten." He paused. "I've offered fortunes for a single meeting. I've been turned down every time. And tonight, in the most unlikely place imaginable, I finally found her." He turned and gestured to Victoria. "Everyone," Blackwell said, "meet Victoria Hayes, the woman behind VH. And I will tell you with no exaggeration that she is worth more than every company represented in this ballroom combined." The applause started slow, uncertain, and then it swelled because the rich understand nothing so instinctively as the arrival of someone more powerful than themselves, and they were falling over each other now to be seen celebrating her. Victoria stood in the center of it, and it should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like grief, because all she could think standing there with the whole room finally turned toward her was how badly she had wanted just one person, one to turn toward her like this, before she had to prove her worth in dollars. She had wanted Alexander to see her when she was quiet, when she was invisible, when there was nothing to gain. He never had. And now the whole world could see her, and it didn't matter, because the only man whose eyes she had wanted was the man who had trained himself to look through her. Alexander stood at the edge of that applause like a man drowning within sight of shore. His investors, the ones he'd spent the night charming, were drifting away from him and gathering around Victoria. His guests, the ones who'd come to honor him, had forgotten he existed. His triumph had become someone else's coronation, and that someone was the wife he'd told to stay quiet. "This isn't real," he muttered. He said it to Olivia, or to himself, or to no one. "This can't be real. She's my wife. She cooks. She organizes parties. She's VH," Olivia said flatly. And there was something almost cruel in the way she said it, the sound of a woman recalculating her own future and finding Alexander no longer in it. "She's been VH this whole time, Alexander. You married one of the most powerful people in the industry, and you spent 5 years treating her like a housekeeper." She let out a short, disbelieving breath. "My God, do you have any idea what you've done?" "You don't get to lecture me," Alexander snapped. "You told me she was nothing. You told me to replace her. You said it. You've been saying it for a year." "I said what you wanted to hear," Olivia said coldly. "That's my job. Was my job." She looked around the room at the shift in gravity at where the power now lived, and she made her decision with the swift ruthlessness that had gotten her this far. "This is a sinking ship, Alexander. I'm not going down with it." "Olivia." But she was already walking away, already smiling, already threading her way toward the crowd around Victoria, already recalculating whether the woman she'd spent 18 months trying to erase might have room in her new empire for a talented communications director. Alexander watched her go, and something in him finally cracked all the way through. He crossed the room to Victoria, pushing past guests who moved out of his way with expressions of open distaste, and he reached her just as the applause was fading. "We need to talk," he said. "Privately. Now." Victoria looked at him. "Anything you want to say to me, Alexander, you can say right here." "You humiliated me," he hissed low and furious. "In front of everyone. In front of the entire industry. You planned this. You've been planning this. You let me walk in here and make a fool of myself in front of Blackwell when you could have told me the truth at any time." And there it was. Even now, even at the bottom of the pit, his first thought was for himself. His humiliation, his image, his fool's walk. "I didn't humiliate you, Alexander," Victoria said, and her calm was more devastating than any shout. "I just stopped protecting you from yourself. There's a difference. For 5 years I covered for you. I fixed your mistakes before anyone saw them. I let you take credit for ideas that were mine at your own dinner table in your own boardroom. I made you look brilliant because I loved you, and because I thought if I made you shine bright enough, you'd finally have enough room in your heart to see me." Her voice didn't waver. "Tonight I just stopped holding the flashlight, and it turns out without me pointing the light at you, there wasn't much there." Alexander flinched like she'd struck him. "That's a lie," he said. "I built Whitmore Holdings. Me, my vision, my work." "Your supply chain has been bleeding money for 2 years," Victoria said quietly. "You've been papering over the losses with new investor money. You restructured the debt 3 times last spring. Your Q4 numbers are a fantasy, and the auditors are asking questions you can't answer." She watched his face go slack with shock. "Yes, Alexander, I know. I've always known. I sat at those dinners and I listened and I understood everything while you told me I wouldn't understand the business." His mouth opened and closed. "How could you possibly—" "Because I'm smarter than you," she said without any pride in it, just a plain and terrible fact she'd hidden for 5 years. "I've always been smarter than you. I let you believe otherwise because your ego couldn't survive the truth, and I was so busy protecting your ego that I forgot to protect myself." The distance between them had never been wider, and it had never been more honest. Across the room, Richard Blackwell was watching them, and he raised a hand and a member of his staff appeared instantly. He murmured something. The staffer nodded and slipped away. Alexander noticed none of it. He was still staring at his wife, and slowly, terribly, a new expression was creeping across his face. Calculation. The gears of the businessman turning even in the middle of catastrophe, looking for an angle and exit, a way to convert disaster back into advantage. "Okay," Alexander said, and his voice changed, softened, became something oily and reasonable. "Okay, Victoria, let's slow down. We're both upset. We've both said things. But listen to me. Think about what we could do together now that this is out. Your name, your reputation, my company, my platform. Blackwell wants you fine. We bring him in through Whitmore. We merge your work into the company. You and me partners finally the way you always wanted. We could be unstoppable." Victoria stared at him. She stared at this man she had married, this man she had loved, this man who, presented with the full truth of who she was, could think of nothing except how to monetize her. Not one word of apology, not one moment of grief for what he'd done to her. Just a pitch, a deal, an angle. And in that moment, whatever tiny ember of feeling had survived 5 years of neglect finally quietly went out. "You want to be partners," she repeated. "Yes," he said eagerly, mistaking her stillness for consideration. "Yes, partners. Isn't that what you wanted, to be seen as my equal? Here it is. I'm offering it to you, right now." "You're not offering me equality, Alexander," she said softly. "You're offering to attach yourself to me because you're drowning, and I'm the nearest solid thing. That's not partnership. That's a man grabbing a life raft." She shook her head slowly. "And even now, even after everything, you can't hear how you sound. You told me an hour ago to go home and change because I embarrassed you. Now that I'm valuable, you want to merge our lives. You didn't fall in love with me tonight, Alexander. You fell in love with my net worth, and that's the whole story of our marriage in one evening." The last of the color left his face. "You're going to leave me," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man finally understanding something. "I left you a long time ago," Victoria said. "I just stayed in the house." Blackwell's staffer returned and murmured something to him, and Blackwell nodded, and then he walked back over to Victoria and Alexander, and his timing, everyone would later agree, was almost surgical. "Ms. Hayes," Blackwell said, ignoring Alexander as thoroughly as he had all evening, "I don't want to intrude on a private moment, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say this before the night gets away from us. I want to fund whatever you build next, not a merger, not a stake in someone else's company." He glanced briefly and pointedly at Alexander. "I want to back you, your name on the door, your vision, your terms, whatever you need in full starting Monday morning." The offer landed in the room like a thunderclap. Alexander made a sound like the air had been knocked out of him, because he had spent months chasing this man for a fraction of what Blackwell had just offered his wife, freely unprompted in the middle of a party. "You can't be serious," Alexander said. "You won't fund my company, but you'll fund hers when she's never even run a company. She's a designer. She has no business experience. She's never—" "Mr. Whitmore," Blackwell interrupted, and his patience had finally run out. "In the time I've known your wife, which is roughly 11 minutes, she has demonstrated more strategic understanding of your industry, your competitors, and frankly, your own company's failures than you have in the years I've watched you from a distance." He let that sit. "I don't invest in job titles. I invest in judgment. And her judgment, even in choosing to endure 5 years of you, has apparently been the only thing holding your empire together." He turned to Victoria. "Think about my offer. There's no rush. I'll wait as long as it takes. I've waited 14 months already." I took her hand again, bowed his head again, and then he did something that would be talked about in that world for years. He turned to the assembled crowd of America's wealthiest people, and he said, "It's been an education, everyone, but I think the most interesting person in this room, and I have taken up enough of the spotlight. Ms. Hayes, may I walk you out when you're ready? I have a car, and I suspect you'd rather not ride home with your current arrangement." Victoria looked at Alexander one last time. He was standing in the wreckage of his own gala, in the ruins of the most important night of his life, and he was looking at her with an expression she had waited 5 years to see. He was finally seeing her, fully, completely, understanding at last exactly who and what she was, and it was too late, and they both knew it. "I'd like that, Mr. Blackwell," Victoria said. "Give me one moment." Blackwell nodded and stepped away to give them privacy, though privacy in that room was an illusion with 100 phones held aloft and 100 pairs of ears straining. "Victoria," Alexander said, and his voice was almost gentle, now gentle in the way of a man who has finally learned tenderness 1 minute after it can do him any good. "Don't do this. Please. Whatever I did wrong, I can fix it. Give me a chance to fix it." "You had 5 years of chances," she said. "Every single day, every dinner where you talked over me, every event where you introduced me by a title instead of a name, every time you told me I wouldn't understand. Every one of those was a chance, Alexander, and you missed all of them because you weren't looking." "I'm looking now," he said desperately. "I know," she said, and for the first time all night there was something soft in her voice, something that sounded almost like mourning. "That's the saddest part. You're looking now, And now I can finally see clearly enough to know that it was never going to be enough. Because a man who only sees you when the world tells him you're valuable was never really seeing you at all. She picked up her emerald clutch. "The lawyers will be in touch," she said. "The apartment is in your name, keep it. The company was always mine, so there's nothing to discuss there. I'm not going to take anything from you, Alexander. I never needed anything from you. That was the one thing you never understood." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't marry you for your money. I married you because I thought you saw something in me. It turns out you never saw me at all. And I'm not going to spend one more day being invisible to a man who married me and never once looked." She turned to go. "Victoria." She stopped, but she didn't turn around. "Did you ever love me?" he asked, and his voice for the first time in 5 years was completely without strategy. It was just a broken question from a hollowed-out man. She stood there for a long moment, her back to him, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath. "Yes," she said quietly. "I loved you so much that I disappeared for you. That's how much I loved you. I made myself into nothing so that you could feel like everything." She took a breath. "That's not something I'll ever do again, for anyone, and that Alexander is the only thing I'll ever thank you for." And then she walked away across the ballroom through the crowd that parted for her, like water past the reporters and the flashing cameras and the whispering elite past Olivia Carter, who tried and failed to catch her eye, past everything she had endured for 5 long years. Richard Blackwell fell into step beside her, and the 2 most powerful people in the room walked out together, and behind them alone in the center of his own gala stood Alexander Whitmore. The music had stopped. The applause was long gone. His investors were on their phones already calling their people, already pulling their money, already distancing themselves from a company whose founder had just publicly revealed himself to be a fool who couldn't see the fortune sitting at his own dinner table. He stood there in his perfect suit, in his perfect ballroom, under his perfect chandeliers, and he watched the doors close behind his wife. And Alexander Whitmore, the genius, the billionaire, the man who built an empire through confidence and ambition, understood for the very first time in his life exactly how it felt to be invisible. He understood it because now suddenly that was all he was. Nobody looked at him. Nobody came to comfort him. Nobody said his name. The room simply flowed around him as if he weren't there the way water flows around a stone. It has already worn smooth, and he stood alone in the wreckage of everything he thought he'd built, learning the lesson his wife had lived every day for 5 years. That the person everyone ignores tonight might just be the person everyone remembers tomorrow. And that he, Alexander Whitmore, had already become the one that everyone was going to forget. The car pulled away from the venue, and for the first time in 5 years, Victoria Hayes felt the strange sensation of moving towards something instead of away from herself. Richard Blackwell sat across from her, and he didn't fill the silence with small talk. That was the first thing she liked about him. He let the quiet be quiet until she was ready. "You're wondering why I offered you everything in the middle of a party," Blackwell said finally. "I'm wondering a lot of things," Victoria admitted. "But yes, that's near the top. Because I've spent 40 years watching people pretend to be more than they are," Blackwell said. "You're the first person I've met in a very long time who was pretending to be less. And a person who hides their strength on purpose is the only kind of person I trust with real power." He studied her. "You could have exposed your husband years ago. You could have taken half his company. You could have humiliated him 100 times over. You didn't. Why?" Victoria looked out at the city lights sliding by. "Because I kept thinking he'd wake up," she said quietly. "I kept thinking if I'm patient enough, if I'm good enough, he'll open his eyes one morning and actually see me." She let out a slow breath. "I wasted 5 years waiting for a blind man to describe the sunrise." Blackwell was silent for a moment. Then he said, "The offer stands, Ms. Hayes. Everything I said in that room I meant. But there's something you should know before you decide anything, something I didn't say in front of that crowd." He leaned forward slightly. "Your husband's company isn't just failing. It's about to become a criminal matter. And when it does, everyone who ever touched it is going to get pulled into the current." He paused. "Including you if you're not careful, because on paper you're still his wife." The words landed like ice water. "What are you talking about?" Victoria asked. "I do my homework," Blackwell said. "Before I chase anyone for 14 months, I learn everything about the world they live in. And in learning about VH, I couldn't help but learn about the man you married." He shook his head. "Whitmore Holdings has been insolvent for at least 18 months, Ms. Hayes. He's been keeping it alive by taking money from new investors to pay returns to old ones and calling it profit. There's a word for that. A Ponzi structure, Victoria said slowly, the pieces clicking into place, all those late-night phone calls, all those lawyers, all those numbers that never quite added up. That's the polite word for it, Blackwell said. The impolite word is fraud. And when it collapses, and it will collapse within weeks, now that tonight happened, the people who lose their money are going to want someone to blame. Your husband is going to point at everyone he can, and you, Victoria, are the person closest to him. He looked at her steadily. You need to protect yourself. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Victoria sat very still. She had known Alexander's company was in trouble. She had known the numbers were wrong, but she had assumed it was ordinary trouble, the kind of mismanagement that gets fixed with restructuring and layoffs. She had not let herself imagine that the man she'd slept beside for 5 years had been quietly stealing from people who trusted him. And yet sitting there, she realized she wasn't surprised. Not really. A man who could look through his own wife for 5 years was a man capable of looking through anyone. The same blindness that let him ignore her was the blindness that let him steal. He simply couldn't see other people as fully real, only as useful or not useful, only as furniture or obstacles. How much have people lost? She asked. They haven't lost it yet, Blackwell said. That's the point. Right now it's all still hidden, but it's coming. And when it comes, it's going to be one of the ugliest financial collapses this city has seen in a decade. He paused. The question you have to answer tonight, Victoria, is a simple one. Whose side of history do you want to be on when the truth comes out? Victoria thought about the investors at the gala, the ones who'd praised Alexander all evening, the ones who trusted him with their retirement funds, their family fortunes, their children's futures because he was so confident, so certain, such a genius. She thought about their faces when they found out what he'd done. He hurt me, she said quietly. For 5 years he made me feel like nothing, and I could walk away from that. I have walked away from that. But this is different. These are people who did nothing wrong except believe him. She looked at Blackwell. The way I believed him. So what do you want to do? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had steel in it that hadn't been there an hour ago. I want to make sure the truth comes out the right way, she said. Not as revenge, as responsibility. Those people deserve to know before they lose everything, and Alexander deserves whatever comes after that. Blackwell smiled slowly, a smile of deep respect. I hoped you'd say that, he said. I have people, lawyers, forensic accountants, the right contacts at the right agencies. If you're willing to help them understand what you know, we can make sure this collapses cleanly. We can make sure the victims are protected first and the guilty second. He paused. But I need you to understand something. The moment you do this, there's no going back. He'll know it was you. He'll call it betrayal. He'll try to take you down with him. Let him try, Victoria said. I've spent 5 years being invisible. He has no idea what I can do when I finally decide to be seen. That was the night Victoria Hayes stopped being a wife who'd been wronged and became something far more dangerous. A woman with the truth, the resources to prove it, and nothing left to lose. Back at the penthouse, Alexander Whitmore was on his 4th scotch and his 20th phone call, and every single call was going worse than the last. Marcus, it's Alexander. Listen, whatever you heard tonight, it's not what it looks like. Marcus, are you there? The line was dead. Marcus had hung up. Marcus, who had been his friend for a decade, who had invested $40 million in Whitmore Holdings, had hung up on him without a word. He called the next name, then the next. Some didn't answer. Some answered only to say they were pulling out. Word had traveled from that ballroom faster than any wire, and the word was simple. Alexander Whitmore is finished, and his wife is the real prize, and no one wants to be caught holding his stock when the music stops. By midnight, Olivia Carter had blocked his number. By 1 a.m, his lead investor had sent a formal notice demanding a full audit of the company's books within 72 hours, or he would go to the authorities himself. By 2, Alexander was sitting alone on the floor of his penthouse, surrounded by the wreckage of a marriage and an empire, and he was starting to understand dimly through the fog of scotch and panic that everything was gone, not going, gone. And somewhere in that fog, the panic curdled into something uglier, because Alexander Whitmore had never in his life accepted that a failure was his own fault. There was always someone to blame, and tonight the someone was obvious. Victoria. She had done this. She had walked into his gala in that dress revealed. Her secret humiliated him, stolen his investor, and destroyed his life. In Alexander's mind, twisted now by alcohol and terror, the truth had rearranged itself into something he could survive. He wasn't a fraud who'd been exposed. He was a good man who'd been betrayed by a scheming wife. He grabbed his phone and called his lawyer, and this call at least got answered. "David, it's Alexander. I need you to draft something first thing in the morning. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm going after everything she has. Her company, her money, all of it." His voice was slurred but vicious. "We were married. What's hers is mine. That's how it works. She hid assets from me for 5 years. That's fraud. She defrauded her own husband. I want half of everything, David, and I want it framed as her deceiving me." There was a long pause on the line. "Alexander," David said carefully, "have you seen the news?" "What news?" "It's everywhere. The gala, your wife, the VH reveal, and there's more." David hesitated. "There are already reporters asking questions about Whitmore Holdings' finances. Someone tipped them off. They're asking about the investor returns, about the accounting." Another pause. "Alexander, I'm your lawyer, so I'm going to give you real advice. Do not file anything against your wife right now. Do not go on the offensive against a woman the entire city is currently celebrating. It will look exactly like what a guilty man does when he's cornered. Lay low. Let this pass." "It's not going to pass," Alexander said. "She made sure of that. So I'm going to make sure she goes down with me. Draft the papers, David. That's an order." He hung up before his lawyer could argue. He did not know, sitting there on the floor at 2 a.m, that his wife was at that very moment in a downtown office building, sitting across a conference table from 3 forensic accountants and 2 attorneys walking them through everything she knew about Whitmore Holdings. Every dinner conversation she'd overheard, every number that hadn't added up, every lawyer's name, every restructuring, every fantasy figure in a quarterly report. He was planning to destroy her. She was already dismantling him brick by careful brick, and she was doing it not with rage but with the patient precision of a woman who had spent 5 years watching and listening and being underestimated. "You understand this company better than his own executives do," one of the accountants said to her at 3 a.m, looking up from his notes with something close to awe. "How is that possible? You didn't work there." Victoria almost smiled. "No," she said. "I just sat at the dinner table and paid attention. Everyone assumed I wasn't listening because everyone assumed I couldn't understand." She shook her head. "That's the thing about being invisible. You see everything because no one thinks to hide anything from a woman they've decided doesn't matter." The forensic accountant looked at her for a long moment. "Your husband," he said slowly, "made the most expensive mistake of his life the day he decided you didn't matter." "Yes," Victoria said quietly. "He did." 3 days later, the story broke. Not the gala story. That had already circled the world, the emerald dress and the reveal, and the billionaire who couldn't see his own wife's worth. That story was fun, gossipy, a delicious piece of schadenfreude for a public that loved watching arrogant men fall. The new story was different. The new story had subpoenas in it. A major financial newspaper published an investigation into Whitmore Holdings, and it laid out in careful documented detail the structure of the fraud. The new investor money, paying old investor returns, the falsified quarterly reports, the 18 months of insolvency hidden behind confidence and charm. The paper didn't name its sources, but it didn't need to. The information was too precise, too intimate, too clearly drawn from someone who had been inside that world for years. By noon, the stock, what was left of it, was frozen. By evening, 2 federal agencies had announced they were opening investigations. By the next morning, Alexander Whitmore's face was on every financial channel in the country, and the word attached to it was no longer genius. The word was fraud. Alexander watched it happen from his penthouse, and the divorce papers his lawyer had reluctantly drafted sat untouched on the kitchen counter because his lawyer had called that morning and quit. "I can't represent you anymore, Alexander," David had said. "This is criminal now. You need a criminal defense attorney, and you need to stop talking to everyone, including me. And Alexander." A pause. "The thing you were planning to do to your wife, whatever you were going to accuse her of, don't. She hasn't said a public word against you, not one. She could have gone on every network in America and buried you. She hasn't. Whatever's happening to you right now, you did it to yourself, and everyone can see that. Don't make it worse by attacking the one person who could have destroyed you and chose not to." Alexander hung up and sat in the silence of his emptying life. The one person who could have destroyed him and chose not to. It wasn't true, of course. She had destroyed him. He was certain of it. The precision of that newspaper story, the intimate knowledge of his books, it could only have come from her. She had done this. She had planned it all, the secret identity, the dress, the reveal, the leak, all of it. A long, slow trap she'd been building for years. He needed to hear her admit it. He needed to look her in the eye and make her say it. He called her. To his surprise, she answered. "Alexander," she said. Her voice was calm, level, the voice of someone who had somewhere to be. "You did this," he said. "The article, the investigations. It was you. You gave them everything." "I told the truth, Alexander," she said. "There's a difference between destroying someone and simply stopping the lies you were telling for them. Those people trusted me," he said, and even now, even in ruin, he couldn't hear how absurd it was coming from him. "You turned them against me. You turned everyone against me. My investors, my friends, Olivia. Your investors are getting their money back because I helped the accountants trace where it went," Victoria said. "Your friends turned against you because they found out what you did not because of anything I said. And Olivia was never yours, Alexander. She was always going to leave the moment you stopped being useful to her. She's the version of you that you never had to marry." She paused. "You surrounded yourself with people who value usefulness over loyalty, and then you were shocked when they treated you the way you taught them to." The words hit him harder than any accusation could have because they weren't an accusation. They were just true. "I'm going to lose everything," Alexander said, and his voice cracked. "The company, the money, everything I built." "Yes," Victoria said quietly. "You are. Doesn't that mean anything to you after everything we... What, Alexander?" she asked, and for the first time there was heat in her voice. "After everything we shared, what did we share? You never let me into your life. You let me clean it and organize it and decorate it, but you never once let me into it. There is no we. There's just a man who used a woman as a backdrop for 5 years, and is only now in the wreckage discovering that the backdrop was the only real thing in the whole production." The line was silent for a long time. "I'm sorry," Alexander finally said, and it was the first genuine thing he'd said to her in years. "Victoria, I'm sorry. I don't know how it happened. I don't know when I stopped seeing you. I swear to God I don't remember the day I decided you didn't matter. It happened so slowly." And Victoria closed her eyes because there was the apology. 5 years too late. The words she had ached to hear through 1,000 silent dinners. And she waited to feel something. Vindication, relief, grief, anything. But all she felt was a kind of distant, gentle pity, the way you might feel for a stranger you read about in the news. "I believe you," she said softly. "I believe it happened slowly. That's the tragedy of it, Alexander. You didn't wake up one day and decide to erase me. You just stopped choosing to see me day after day until one day the choice had made itself." She took a breath. "But your being sorry doesn't undo 5 years. And it doesn't change what you did to those investors. Being sorry is not the same as being different. You're sorry now because you're suffering the consequences. That's not remorse, that's regret, and they are not the same thing." "How do I make it right?" he asked. "Tell me how. I'll do anything." "You can't make it right with me," she said. "That door closed a long time ago, and you're the one who closed it. But you can make it right with them. Cooperate with the investigation. Tell the truth. Help the people you hurt get back what they lost. Take responsibility instead of looking for someone to blame." She paused. "That's the only path left that leads anywhere good, Alexander. And I don't know if you're capable of walking it. I hope for your sake that you are." "And you?" he asked. "What are you going to do?" Victoria opened her eyes, and out her window, the city stretched out before her. No longer a place she watched from behind her husband, but a place that was finally fully hers. "I'm going to build something," she said, "with my own name on it. Something I don't have to hide, something I don't have to shrink for." She paused. "I'm going to become the person I buried 5 years ago when I decided a man's love was worth disappearing for." Her voice softened, but not with sadness, with resolve. "I'm going to be seen, Alexander, for the rest of my life, and I'm never going to apologize for taking up space again." There was nothing left for him to say. He knew it. She knew it. "Goodbye, Alexander," she said gently. "I hope you find your way. I really do." And she hung up, and she stood there for a moment in the quiet, and she waited one last time for the grief to come, for the collapse, for the flood of everything she'd held back for 5 years. It didn't come. Instead, something rose in her chest that she almost didn't recognize because it had been so long since she'd felt it. It was lightness. It was the feeling of a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was a weight finally lifting. She was free. Across the city, Alexander Whitmore sat alone in a penthouse that would soon belong to the creditors, holding a dead phone, surrounded by the silence of a life that had emptied itself out in 3 days, and he finally understood the full shape of what he'd done. He had been handed a treasure and had called it nothing. He had married one of the most brilliant, generous, powerful women alive, and he had spent 5 years training himself not to look at her. And when the whole world finally opened its eyes and saw her for what she was, he'd had one chance, one single chance to see her too, to choose her to become the man who deserved her. And instead, he had reached for a life raft. The genius, the billionaire, the man who built an empire. He had lost it all, and worst of all, he understood now that the empire had never been the thing worth keeping. She had been, and she was gone. The freedom lasted exactly 6 days. On the 7th day, Victoria Hayes received a phone call that told her Alexander had not in fact chosen the path that led anywhere good. "Ms. Hayes, this is Karen Voss. I'm one of the attorneys working with Mr. Blackwell's team on the Whitmore matter." The voice was crisp, professional, and carrying an undertone of warning. "I need to tell you something before you hear it from anyone else. Your husband has retained a criminal defense attorney, an aggressive one, and they've filed a response to the investigation that names you as a co-conspirator." Victoria set down her coffee slowly. "Excuse me. He's claiming that you were the financial mastermind behind Whitmore Holdings," Karen said, "that you used your business expertise, which he now admits you have to design the fraudulent structure, and that you manipulated him into executing it. He's positioning himself as a victim of his brilliant, scheming wife." A pause. "It's absurd, and it won't hold up. But it's going to be ugly, and it's going to be public, and I wanted you to be ready." Victoria closed her eyes. She had given him a chance. On the phone 6 days ago, she had told him exactly what the path forward looked like. Cooperate, tell the truth, take responsibility. And instead, the moment his back was truly against the wall, Alexander Whitmore had reached for the oldest weapon in his arsenal, the one he'd been using their entire marriage. When something goes wrong, find a woman to blame. "He's saying I built the fraud," Victoria repeated. "The fraud in the company I never worked at. The company whose books I only knew about because I overheard him at dinner." "That's his story," Karen confirmed. "And here's the part you need to understand, Victoria. He's going to make this about your credibility versus his. He's going to argue that a woman who hid her entire identity from her own husband for 5 years is not a woman anyone should believe. He's going to weaponize your secret against you." A pause. "He's going to say if she lied about who she was, what else did she lie about?" And there it was, the trap inside the trap, the thing Victoria had feared from the very beginning, the reason she'd stayed invisible for so long. Her secret, the thing that had protected her for years, was now going to be turned into the very thing that made her look guilty. "How bad is this?" Victoria asked quietly. "Honestly," Karen said, "if we don't get ahead of it bad, juries are unpredictable. He's charming, he's practiced, and he's going to cry on cue in front of every camera in the country. And you." Karen hesitated. "You're going to look like exactly what he's describing. A woman who operated in the shadows, who hid fortunes, who revealed herself in a calculated moment to destroy her husband." A pause. "I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's a story, and he's very good at telling stories. You said so yourself." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then something hardened in her, cold and clear. "Karen," she said, "you said he's going to make this about credibility, his story versus mine." "Yes." "Then let's make sure my story is bulletproof," Victoria said. "Because here's what he doesn't understand. He thinks my secret makes me look guilty. But my secret is the most documented, verified, ironclad thing in my entire life. Every VH contract has a paper trail going back 15 years. Every payment, every client, every design. I didn't hide in the shadows because I was doing something wrong, Karen. I hid because I was protecting something valuable, and I can prove every single day of it." She paused. "He's about to learn the difference between a man who hides because he's a criminal and a woman who hides because she's a target." There was a beat of silence on the line, and then Karen said with something like admiration, "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about being disbelieved my entire life," Victoria said. "I just never thought the man I married would be the one to test it. Send me everything he's filed, all of it. I want to read every word he's saying about me." That afternoon, Victoria sat in Blackwell's downtown offices and read her husband's legal filing, and it was worse than she'd imagined. It wasn't just a defense, it was a portrait. A carefully painted picture of a cold, calculating woman who had married a good man under false pretenses, concealed a vast fortune and a hidden identity, and orchestrated an elaborate scheme to first build up his company and then destroy it, positioning herself to inherit his industry connections while he took the fall. Alexander had even found a narrative for the emerald dress. He'd called it in the filing the culmination of a long-planned public execution. She read it twice, and the strangest thing happened. She stopped feeling afraid. Because reading it, she finally understood something about her husband that 5 years of marriage had never made clear. Alexander Whitmore didn't lie because he was desperate. He lied because he genuinely could not distinguish between the story that served him and the truth. In his own mind right now, he probably believed every word of that filing. He had rewritten history so completely, so instantly, that he'd become the hero of his own catastrophe. And a man who believes his own lies is a man who will never, ever stop. "He'll never take responsibility," she said aloud, and Blackwell, sitting across from her, nodded slowly. "No," Blackwell agreed. "Men like this don't. I've watched them my whole career. They'd rather burn down everything and everyone around them than accept that the fire started with their own hand." He leaned forward. "Which is why you cannot fight this the way he wants you to fight it, Victoria. He wants a mud fight. Story versus story. Character versus character. He wins that fight because he's been practicing it his whole life." "Then how do I fight it?" "You don't fight the story," Blackwell said. "You bury it under so much verified fact that the story simply can't breathe." He slid a folder across the table. "My forensic team has finished tracing the money, every dollar. And here's what we found, Victoria. The fraud didn't start 18 months ago. It started 6 years ago." He paused. 6 months before he married you." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. "Before we married," she repeated slowly. "The structure was already in place when he met you," Blackwell said quietly. "The false reporting, the investor shuffle. It was all running before you ever walked into his life, which means the one thing he cannot claim, the one story that collapses the instant we show the timeline, is that you built it." He let that sit. "You couldn't have built the fraud, Victoria. It was already breathing before he ever knew your name. The paper proves it, down to the day." Victoria stared at the folder, and a wave of nausea rolled through her, followed by something colder. "Understanding. That's why he married me," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "It wasn't love. It was never love. He was already sinking 6 years ago, and he needed." She stopped the pieces assembling themselves into a shape she didn't want to see. He needed a respectable wife, a beautiful, quiet, respectable wife to make him look stable, to make him look like a family man with nothing to hide. I was Camouflage Richard. From the very first day, I was part of the cover story. Blackwell didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His silence confirmed it. And Victoria, who had spent 5 years believing that her husband had slowly stopped seeing her now, understood a far more devastating truth. He had never seen her at all, not even at the beginning, not even on their wedding day. She had been a prop from the moment he chose her. The love she thought had faded had never existed in the first place. She had spent 5 years mourning the loss of something she'd never actually had. For a moment, the grief she'd been waiting for finally arrived. Not grief for the marriage, grief for the young woman who'd walked down that aisle believing she was chosen when she'd only ever been used. And then slowly the grief turned into something else, something that would carry her through everything that came next. Resolve. "Okay," Victoria said, and her voice was steady again. "He wants to make this a war over who I am. Fine. Then I'm going to show him and everyone exactly who I am. And it's going to be the last thing his story survives." The next 2 weeks moved fast. Victoria did not go on television. She did not give a single tearful interview. She did not respond to a single one of Alexander's public claims, even as his defense team leaked more and more of them to a hungry press. While Alexander was everywhere on every panel, crying, gesturing, painting himself as the wronged husband of a manipulative genius, Victoria was silent. and her silence, it turned out, was the most powerful weapon of all. Because while Alexander talked, Victoria's legal team worked. They assembled 15 years of VH documentation, every contract notarized, every client willing to testify to her integrity, her professionalism, her refusal to ever cut a corner. They assembled the forensic timeline that proved the fraud predated the marriage. They assembled testimony from the two accountants who had watched Victoria trace the stolen money with more skill than the professionals. And they assembled one more thing, the thing that would end it. Because it turned out that Victoria wasn't the only person Alexander had used as camouflage over the years. And when word got around that the great Alexander Whitmore was going down and going down hard, other people began to come forward. A former business partner he'd cheated out of a patent. An early employee he'd blamed for his own accounting errors. A woman years before Victoria who told a chillingly familiar story about being made invisible, being blamed, being cast as the villain when Alexander's schemes went wrong. The pattern was undeniable. Alexander Whitmore had spent his entire life doing exactly one thing when cornered: finding a person to blame and rewriting them into a villain. And now there were too many of them to ignore. The moment it all turned came on a Tuesday afternoon in a deposition that was supposed to be routine. Alexander's attorney had insisted on deposing Victoria, certain they could rattle her, catch her in a contradiction, expose the scheming woman underneath the calm surface. Victoria arrived in a simple gray suit, sat down across from a table full of lawyers, and answered every question with a quiet, unshakable precision that made her husband's attorney increasingly nervous. "Mrs. Whitmore," the attorney said, "you concealed your identity as VH from your husband for the entire duration of your marriage. Is that correct?" "Yes," Victoria said. "So you're a person comfortable with deception." "I'm a person comfortable with privacy," Victoria said. "There's a difference. I never lied about a single fact. I never signed a false document. I never took a dollar that wasn't mine or gave anyone a dollar that was theirs. I simply chose not to publicize my work. That's not deception, counselor. That's discretion. My husband, on the other hand, told investors their money was growing when it was gone. That's deception. And I think everyone in this room understands the difference." The attorney's jaw tightened. "You expect us to believe that a woman as intelligent as you claim to be lived with a man running a fraud for 5 years and knew nothing about it?" "No," Victoria said calmly. "I knew about it." The room went still. Even Victoria's own lawyers tensed. "I'm sorry," the attorney said. "I knew something was wrong," Victoria said. "I knew the numbers didn't add up. I knew the phone calls were secret. I suspected in the last year that it might be something illegal." She looked directly at the attorney. "And I did the thing that finally makes me look guilty in your client's story. I stayed, for a while, because I was married to him, and because I kept hoping there was an explanation, and because I loved a man who it turns out never existed." She paused. "But the moment I had proof, the moment I understood what he'd actually done, I went to the authorities. I helped trace the money. I helped protect the victims. So yes, counselor, I knew. And knowing is exactly why those investors are getting their money back. Your client is welcome to explain to the jury why he'd rather I had stayed quiet." The attorney had no follow-up. There was no follow-up to have. That deposition leaked within days, as everything in that case was leaked, ended Alexander's public campaign. Because the story he'd been selling the innocent man betrayed by a scheming wife could not survive a recording of that scheming wife, calmly explaining that she was the reason the victims would be made whole. The public, which had been enjoying the drama, made up its mind fast. Alexander was the villain. Victoria was the woman who'd done the right thing at great personal cost. And the emerald dress, which Alexander had tried to reframe as a calculated execution, became something else entirely in the public imagination. It became the moment a woman finally refused to disappear. Alexander watched his own narrative collapse in real time, and something in him finally broke. He called Victoria one last time. It was late near midnight, and she almost didn't answer. But she did because some part of her needed to hear whatever this was going to be. "You win," Alexander said. His voice was hollow, scraped clean of the charm and the fury both. "Is that what you wanted to hear? You win. They're going to convict me. My attorney says 15 years, maybe more. Everything's gone. Everyone's gone. You win, Victoria." "This was never a game I wanted to win, Alexander," Victoria said quietly. "You made it a war. I just refused to lose it." "I found out something," he said, and there was a strange broken laugh in his voice. About the fraud. It started before we married. Did you know that my own lawyers found it? The thing I built to survive it was already there when I met you. A pause. I've been trying to remember why I married you, and I can't. I actually can't remember. I keep reaching for it, and there's nothing there. I think I married you because you looked stable, and I needed to look stable. Another pause longer. God, what kind of a man doesn't even remember why he married his wife? And Victoria, standing at her window, realized that this was the closest Alexander had ever come to seeing himself clearly. At the very bottom, with everything stripped away, he had finally caught a glimpse of the emptiness where a soul should have been. I already knew, she said gently, about the marriage, about what I was to you. I figured it out a few weeks ago. She took a breath. For a while it broke my heart, Alexander, thinking that I was never chosen, that I was just useful, that the love I gave you for 5 years landed on someone who couldn't even remember why I was there. She paused. But you know what I've realized? It doesn't matter why you married me. It matters why I stayed as long as I did and why I finally left. And both of those answers are about me, not you. I stayed because I believed in love. I left because I finally believed in myself more. Those are the only 2 facts in our marriage that were ever really mine. I'm sorry, Alexander whispered, for all of it. I know it's worthless. I know it's too late, but I need you to know I'm sorry. I know you are, Victoria said. And she did know. She could hear that this apology, unlike all the others, was real. It was the apology of a man who had finally run out of stories to tell himself and was left alone with the plain and terrible truth of what he'd done. I forgive you, Alexander, she said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry you with me for one more day. Forgiveness isn't a gift I'm giving you. It's a weight I'm putting down. Do you understand? No, he admitted. You will, she said. Someday when you've faced what you've done, really faced it, you'll understand. And I hope when that day comes, you learn to forgive yourself too. Not for my sake, for the sake of whoever you might still become. She paused. Goodbye, Alexander. This is the last time we'll speak. Victoria, goodbye. And she hung up for the last time, and she stood at her window and watched the city she had once observed from behind her husband, and she felt the final thread between them go slack and fall away. Alexander Whitmore was convicted 3 months later. The empire he'd built through confidence and ambition was revealed to be exactly what it always was. A beautiful facade with nothing behind it, held together by other people's money and one man's refusal to ever tell the truth. The investors, thanks to Victoria and Blackwell's forensic team, recovered most of what they'd lost. Olivia Carter, who had abandoned him at the gala, was investigated for her role in his communications strategy and quietly disappeared from the industry. The penthouse, the cars, the accounts, all of it was liquidated to repay the people Alexander had deceived. And the man himself, the genius, the billionaire, the founder, who had once commanded every room he entered, became something he'd spent his whole life running from. A cautionary tale, a name people used as a warning, a man defined in the end not by what he built, but by what he'd been too blind to see. But that is his ending, and this was never really his story. Because while Alexander's world collapsed into rubble, Victoria Hayes was quietly, steadily building something new, something with her own name carved into the stone above the door, something she would never have to hide, never have to shrink, for never have to make smaller, so that a smaller person could feel large. She had walked into that gala as a wife told to stay quiet. She had walked out as a woman who would never be quiet again. And the best part of her story, the part that would inspire thousands of people who had ever been made to feel invisible, was that it hadn't even truly begun. The morning after that final phone call, Victoria woke up before dawn, and for a long moment she didn't know where she was. Not because the room was unfamiliar. She'd been sleeping in the same hotel suite for weeks, ever since she'd walked out of the penthouse. But because for the first time in 5 years, she woke up without the low, constant hum of dread that had lived in her chest every single morning of her marriage. That feeling of bracing, that feeling of preparing to be small. It was gone, and its absence was so total that for a moment she'd genuinely forgotten who she was supposed to be. Then she remembered, and she smiled at the ceiling. She was nobody's wife, she was nobody's backdrop, she was VH, and she was Victoria Hayes, and for the first time in her adult life, those two people were about to become one person out loud in front of everyone. But first there was work to do, because building a new life, she was learning, was a lot harder than surviving an old one. Her phone rang at 7 that morning. It was Grace, her former assistant, the young woman who had helped her into the emerald gown on that night that felt like a lifetime ago. "Mrs. Whit," Grace stopped herself. "Ms. Hayes, sorry, I keep doing that." "You can call me Victoria Grace," Victoria said warmly. "I think after everything we've earned first names." "Victoria," Grace repeated, and Victoria could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm calling because I quit. This morning, I walked into the estate manager's office and I told him I wasn't going to keep working for a household that treated you the way it did, and I quit." A pause, suddenly nervous. "I know that was probably stupid. I don't have another job lined up, but I couldn't keep taking a paycheck from that man's accounts. Not after what I know now." Victoria was quiet for a moment, and something warm moved through her chest. "Grace," she said, "how would you feel about coming to work for me instead?" There was a sharp intake of breath on the line. "You mean it?" "I'm building something new," Victoria said. "I'm going to need people around me, people I can trust. And you're the only person in that entire household who ever looked at me and saw an actual human being instead of a piece of furniture." She paused. "That kind of loyalty is rarer than talent, Grace. I'd be a fool not to keep you close. So yes, I mean it. Come work for me. We'll figure out the title later. Right now, I just need people in my corner who are there because they believe in it, not because of a paycheck." Grace started crying the happy kind, and Victoria let her, because after 5 years of swallowing her own tears, she'd developed a deep respect for anyone brave enough to let theirs fall. That was the first hire. There would be many more, because it turned out that the moment the world learned who VH was, the world came knocking. And not the way it had come knocking for Alexander with its hand out looking to take. It came knocking with its hands full, looking to give. Within a week of the deposition leak, Victoria's phone had become a portal to another life. The luxury houses she'd worked with anonymously for years, now freed from their non-disclosure agreements by the public reveal, began reaching out openly, publicly, proudly. Houses in Paris and Milan and London that had spent years pretending they didn't need help now issued glowing statements about the genius who had saved them. A designer who had spent 15 years in the shadows suddenly found herself the most sought-after name in the entire industry. But the offer that mattered most came from Richard Blackwell, and it came over a quiet dinner 2 weeks after Alexander's world had finished collapsing. "I meant what I said at the gala," Blackwell told her, setting down his fork. "Every word. I want to fund whatever you build. Your name on the door, your vision, your terms. But I've been thinking about it, and I want to add something to the offer." He paused. "I don't want to be your investor, Victoria. Investors are a dime a dozen for someone like you now. Anyone in this city would write you a check." He leaned forward. "I want to be your partner, the junior one. I want to help you build something that lasts 100 years, and I want to spend the last good decade of my career doing it. I've made all the money a man could ever need. What I haven't done, not once, is help build something purely because it deserved to exist." A pause. "You'd be doing me the favor, Victoria, not the other way around." Victoria studied the old man across the table, this man who had walked into her husband's gala and refused to look at anyone but her. This man who had warned her, protected her, believed in her, when the whole world was still deciding whether to. "Why me, Richard?" she asked quietly. "Really, you could partner with anyone. Why the woman everyone had just spent 5 years ignoring?" Blackwell was quiet for a moment. "Because 40 years ago," he said, "there was a woman who saw something in me when I was nothing, when I was a nobody with a bad suit and a big idea and no one who'd take a meeting with me. She was the only person who looked at me and saw what I could become instead of what I was." He paused and his voice roughened slightly. "She was my wife. She died 11 years ago, and I've spent every year since then wishing I'd told her just once more that I knew, that I always knew it was her belief that built everything I have." He looked at Victoria. "When I watched your husband look through you at that gala, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt furious, because I recognized exactly what he was throwing away, and I decided right there that if he was too blind to see it, I wasn't going to make the same mistake." He smiled sadly. "So that's why you, Victoria. Because I know what it's like to be seen by someone who didn't have to, and I know what it's worth. And I refuse to watch a woman like you disappear just because one small man couldn't understand what he'd been given." Victoria didn't say anything for a long moment. Her throat was too tight. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Partners," she said. "The two of us. Let's build something that lasts." Blackwell smiled, and for a moment he looked like a young man again. "Partners," he agreed. The work of building consumed the next 6 months, and it was the happiest Victoria had been in her entire adult life. Not because it was easy. It wasn't. There were long nights and impossible problems and days when she wanted to throw her laptop across the room. She was learning to run a company in public under her own name, with reporters watching her every move, half of them hoping she'd fail so they could write the story about the designer who couldn't handle the spotlight. There were vendors who tried to cheat her, thinking a woman new to the business wouldn't notice. There were competitors who spread quiet rumors hoping to slow her down. There was the constant, exhausting work of proving over and over that she belonged where she now stood. But here was the difference that made all the exhaustion feel like joy instead of misery. For 5 years she had worked just as hard, sacrificed just as much, given just as fully. And all of it had gone to make a man look good who never even said thank you. All of it had disappeared into a marriage that used her and gave nothing back. Now every hour she spent went towards something that was hers. Every problem she solved made her own dreams stronger, not someone else's ego. Every late night added a brick to a house with her name on it, and that she discovered changed everything. The same hours that had drained her dry as a wife filled her up as a founder. Because effort spent on your own becoming is never really effort at all. It's just the feeling of finally being alive. She thought about Alexander sometimes, not with anger anymore. The anger had burned off somewhere in those 6 months, replaced by something quieter. She'd heard through the industry grapevine that he was in a minimum security facility upstate, that he spent his days in the prison library, that according to one former associate who'd visited, he'd stopped telling the story where he was the victim, that he'd finally, in the silence of a cell, run out of people to blame and been left alone with himself. She hoped it was true. She hoped that somewhere in that quiet, Alexander Whitmore was finally learning to see. Not her, it was too late for that, but himself. The empty place where a real person should have been, because until he saw that, until he faced it fully, he would never become anything more than what he'd been. And she'd meant what she told him. She did hope for the sake of whoever he might still become that he found his way. But she didn't wait for it. She didn't check for it. She didn't organize her healing around whether her ex-husband ever became a decent man. That was the old Victoria, the one who arranged her entire life around a man's potential to change. The new Victoria understood a truth that had taken her 38 years to learn. You cannot build your life on someone else's someday. You can only build it on your own today. And so she built. The headquarters opened on a bright morning in early spring in a beautiful old building in Manhattan that she'd chosen specifically because it had good bones and honest light. Her name was carved into the stone above the entrance. Not initials, not a hidden brand. Her full name in letters 2 feet tall for the whole city to see. Victoria Hayes. She stood across the street the morning before the opening, looking up at those letters, and Grace stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "You know what I keep thinking about," Victoria finally said. "What?" "The black dress," Victoria said, and she laughed softly. "The plain black dress he handed me and told me to wear so I wouldn't embarrass him, so I'd disappear into the background one more time." She shook her head, still looking up at her name. "For 5 years I let him hand me that dress. Metaphorically, I mean. Every single day. He'd hand me some version of that dress, some instruction to be smaller, quieter, less, and I'd put it on, because I thought that's what love asked of me." She paused. "And then one night, I decided not to wear it. Just one night. Just once I decided to be seen." She turned to Grace. "And look what happened. My whole life was waiting on the other side of one decision to stop disappearing." Grace's eyes were wet. "Do you ever wish you'd done it sooner? Stop disappearing?" Victoria considered the question honestly. "I used to," she said. "I used to torture myself about the 5 years I lost, all the time I spent proving my worth to someone who never wanted to see it." She looked back up at her name in the stone. "But I've made peace with it, because I don't think I could have built this at 25 or 30. I needed those 5 years, even the terrible parts, especially the terrible parts. I needed to learn exactly what it cost to shrink yourself for someone else's comfort. I needed to hit the very bottom of that to feel it all the way down so that I'd never ever be tempted to do it again." She smiled. The woman who could build this building is a woman who knows in her bones what the alternative feels like. And that woman was forged in those 5 years. So no, Grace, I don't wish I'd done it sooner. I did it exactly when I was ready, and now I'm ready for everything. The next morning the doors opened, and Victoria Hayes walked into her own headquarters, under her own name at the head of her own company. And she was, for the first time in her entire life, completely and unmistakably visible. No one stood in front of her. No one told her to stay quiet. No one handed her a plain black dress and told her not to embarrass them. She walked through those doors as herself, whole and unhidden, and the light coming through those honest windows fell on her like something she'd waited her entire life to feel. Recognition, not from a crowd, not from an investor, not even from a husband, from herself. She had finally, after all those years, been seen by the one person whose vision mattered most. She had finally looked at herself and understood without apology exactly what she was worth. And that she would come to understand was the real ending of the story. Not the gala, not the emerald dress, not Alexander's fall. Those were just the events. The real story, the one that mattered, was quieter and far more important. It was the story of a woman who had spent 5 years waiting to be seen by someone else, and who had finally gloriously decided to see herself. 6 months after those doors opened, Victoria Hayes stood backstage at the largest luxury business conference in America, listening to a crowd of 3,000 people settle into their seats, and she felt the old ghost of an old fear brush against her, the fear of being seen. It was funny, she thought. You'd imagine that once you decided to stop hiding, the fear of visibility would simply vanish. It doesn't. It just changes shape. For 5 years, the fear had whispered, "Stay small, stay quiet. Don't take up space." Now standing in the wings before she walked out to accept the biggest honor of her career, a new version of that old fear whispered something else. "Who do you think you are? Who are you to stand up there? They're going to find out you don't belong." Grace appeared at her elbow, holding a bottle of water, watching her face carefully. "You've got that look," Grace said. "What look?" "The look you get right before you try to disappear," Grace said gently. "The shoulders, they start to curl in. I've been watching you do it for 2 years now. Every time something big is about to happen, your body tries to make you smaller." She handed Victoria the water. "You're not that woman anymore, Victoria. Stand up straight. Your name is on a building. You earned this stage 100 times over." Victoria looked at the young woman who had quit a comfortable job on principle 2 years ago, and who was now one of the most trusted executives in her company, and she felt her shoulders settle back where they belonged. "You know," Victoria said, "there was a night 2 years ago when I made you promise something, right before I walked into that gala." "I remember," Grace said softly. "You told me not to let you shrink. Not 1 inch." "Not 1 inch," Victoria repeated. "You've been keeping that promise for 2 years, Grace, whether I asked you to or not." She squeezed the younger woman's hand. "Thank you for seeing me before the whole world did." A stagehand appeared, holding a headset. "Ms. Hayes, 2 minutes. They're going to introduce you, then you're on." Victoria nodded. And out beyond the curtain, she heard the announcer's voice begin to warm up. The crowd heard the applause building, heard 3,000 people ready to celebrate a woman they now considered a legend. And in that moment, standing in the dark just before the light, Victoria let herself remember all of it. Not to torture herself, to honor it, because everything she was about to walk into had been paid for by everything she had walked through. She remembered the plain black dress. She remembered 5 years of dinners where she poured wine and swallowed her own brilliance. She remembered the sound of Olivia's voice through a half-open door, saying she knows her place. She remembered the exact weight of the emerald gown in her hands and the moment she decided to put it on. She remembered Richard Blackwell crossing that ballroom and ignoring her husband's outstretched hand. She remembered the phone calls, the depositions, the discovery that she'd been camouflaged from the very first day. She remembered forgiving Alexander, not because he deserved it, but because she refused to carry him any further. And she remembered the morning the doors opened, and she'd looked up at her name carved in stone, and she'd finally been seen by the one person who mattered most, herself. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice rang out, "it is my profound honor to present this year's Entrepreneur of the Year. From complete anonymity to the head of one of the most respected companies in the luxury world in just 2 years. A designer, a founder, a force. Please welcome to the stage Victoria Hayes." The applause hit her like a wave as she walked out, and this time she didn't shrink from it. This time she walked into it straight-backed chin level, moving across that stage, the way she'd once moved across a ballroom in emerald green, like a woman who had built the room and was deciding whether to let them all stay. 3,000 people rose to their feet. Victoria reached the podium, and she looked out at that ocean of faces, and she waited for the applause to fade. And as she stood there, she caught sight of a familiar face near the front row. Richard Blackwell, her partner, her friend, the old man who had refused to let her disappear. He wasn't clapping. He was just looking at her with the quiet pride of a man watching something he'd helped protect finally become everything it was meant to be. And when their eyes met, he gave her a small nod, the same nod he'd given her across the ballroom 2 years before, the nod that said, "Go on, I see you, now show them all." Victoria smiled, and she began to speak. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady and warm and carried to every corner of that enormous room. "Thank you. I have to be honest with you. 2 years ago, if you had told me I'd be standing on this stage, I wouldn't have believed you. Not because I doubted my work. I never doubted my work." A pause. "I wouldn't have believed you because 2 years ago, I had spent most of my adult life making sure no one ever looked at me at all." The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that means people have stopped being an audience and started being human beings leaning in. "For years," Victoria continued, "I hid who I was. I built things under a name that wasn't a name, just 2 letters, so that no one would ever see the woman behind them. And I told myself I did it to protect my work, to let the work speak for itself." She paused. "But I want to tell you the truth tonight, because I think some of you need to hear it. I didn't hide because I was protecting my work. I hid because somewhere along the way, I had learned to believe that I was safer invisible. That being seen was dangerous, that the smartest thing a woman like me could do was to take up as little space as possible and hope that if I was small enough and useful enough and quiet enough, I'd finally be worthy of the love and the respect I was so desperate for." A woman in the third row wiped her eyes, then another. The silence had a texture now thick with recognition, 3,000 people hearing a truth they'd each carried alone. "I married a man who was very happy to let me stay invisible," Victoria said, and there was no bitterness in it, just honesty. In fact, he preferred it. He handed me quite literally a plain black dress and told me to wear it to an important party so that I wouldn't embarrass him, so that I would fade into the background. One more time. She let that sit. And that night, for reasons I still can't fully explain, I decided not to wear it. I decided after 5 years of disappearing to let the world see me, just once, just for one night. She looked out at the crowd. "I want to tell you what I learned that night," she said, "because it's the only thing I really came here to say, and everything else is just decoration." She gripped the edges of the podium. "I learned that the whole time I was hiding, I thought I was protecting myself. But I wasn't protecting myself. I was abandoning myself. Every time I made myself smaller so someone else could feel larger, I wasn't being humble. I was disappearing. And there is a word for slowly making yourself disappear so that someone else is more comfortable. That word is not love. That word is not humility. That word is self-erasure." Her voice rose steady and clear. "And I am here tonight to tell every single person in this room who has ever done it, who has ever dimmed their own light so that someone else could shine, that you can stop. Right now. Tonight. You are allowed to be seen. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to be the fullest, largest, brightest version of yourself. And you do not owe anyone an apology for it." The applause that broke over the room was not polite. It was something else. It was thousands of people standing up because a woman had just said out loud the thing they'd needed permission to believe. Victoria waited, and when it settled, she spoke more softly. "A reporter asked me a question backstage tonight," she said. "She asked me what the hardest moment of my journey was, and I gave her a polite answer because I didn't have time to give her the real one. But I have time now, so I'll give the real one to you." She paused. She assumed the hardest moment was losing my marriage, losing the life I'd built, the public humiliation, the lawsuits, the betrayal, but it wasn't any of those things. Her voice caught just slightly, and she let it. The hardest moment of my journey wasn't losing someone who didn't appreciate me. Losing him was the easy part. Losing him felt like putting down something heavy I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was heavy. She looked out at them. The hardest moment was realizing that I had spent 5 years of my one precious life trying to prove my worth to someone who was never, ever going to see it. Not because I wasn't worthy, but because he wasn't looking. And no amount of me being worthy was ever going to fix a man who had decided not to look. The room was utterly silent now. "That's the trap," Victoria said quietly. "That's the trap so many of us fall into. We think that if we're just good enough, just patient enough, just worthy enough, the person who refuses to see us will finally open their eyes. And so we pour ourselves out year after year, trying to earn a recognition that was never being withheld because of anything we did." She shook her head slowly. "You cannot earn your way into being seen by someone who has chosen to be blind. And the moment I understood that the moment I stopped trying to prove my worth to someone who wasn't looking was the moment my real life finally began." She let the silence hold for a long beat. And then when she spoke again, her voice had lifted, warmed, opened into something almost like joy. "So here is what I want to leave you with tonight," Victoria said. "Because I didn't come here just to tell you a sad story about a marriage. I came here to tell you a true story about a life." She smiled. "For most of my life, I let other people's opinions become the ceiling of what I believed I could be. I let one man's inability to see me become the measure of my own worth. And I want to tell you from the very bottom of my heart, having lived it and survived it, and come out the other side, standing on this stage, that this is the greatest mistake a human being can make." Her voice rang out strong and final. "Never allow someone else's opinion to become the limit of your own potential. Never let a person who refuses to see you convince you that you are not worth seeing. The problem was never your light. The problem was always their eyes." The room erupted, 3,000 people on their feet, and the sound of it rolled over Victoria like warm water, and she stood there and let herself receive it, not shrinking from it, not deflecting it, just standing fully visible in the light she had once been so afraid of, and letting it fall on her exactly as she deserved. But the moment that broke her, the moment she would remember for the rest of her life, came a few minutes later, after she'd left the stage. She was standing backstage, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, when Grace approached with a strange expression on her face and a phone in her hand. "Victoria," Grace said quietly, "there's a message for you. It came to the company account during your speech. I almost didn't show you, but I think you need to see it." She hesitated. "It's from Alexander." Victoria went still. She hadn't heard his name spoken aloud in over a year. She'd built a whole life in the space where he used to be. And for a moment, the old reflex flickered, the bracing, the shrinking. Then she took a breath and let it pass. "Read it to me," she said. Grace looked down at the phone. "It says," Grace read slowly, "Victoria, I saw the recording of your speech. Someone here made sure I saw it. I've watched it 4 times now." She paused. "I don't remember why I married you. I told you that once, and it's still true, and it's still the most shameful thing I've ever admitted. But watching you tonight, I finally understand what I threw away. Not your money, not your talent. You, the person, the one I never once looked at." Grace's voice wavered. "You said the problem was never your light, it was our eyes. And I've spent 2 years in here learning to see, and I want you to know that I see it now. All of it. Everything I was too small to see for 5 years. I'm not asking for anything. There's nothing to ask for. I just needed you to know that the woman I couldn't see is the most extraordinary person I've ever known, and I will regret being blind to her for the rest of my life. You were always the Empire Victoria. I just built the wrong thing." Grace lowered the phone. Victoria stood there for a long moment, and something moved through her that she hadn't expected. Not grief, not anger, not even satisfaction. Peace. Because here at last was the thing she had ached for through 5 years of silent dinners. Alexander Whitmore had finally seen her, fully, completely. And 2 years ago, hearing these words would have meant everything to her. 2 years ago, she would have organized her entire heart around them. But now she understood that his seeing her had never been the point. Her whole life had changed, not on the day Alexander finally opened his eyes, but on the day she stopped waiting for him to. She had already seen herself. She had already built the empire. She had already become the woman standing in the light. His recognition was no longer the sunrise she'd waited on for 5 years. It was just a sunset on something that had ended a long time ago. "Do you want to respond?" Grace asked softly. Victoria thought about it, and then she shook her head and she smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who is finally completely free. "No," she said gently, "not because I'm angry. I'm not angry anymore. I forgave him a long time ago. She looked at Grace. I'm not responding because there's nothing left to say. He finally sees me, and I'm glad for his sake that he does. I hope it helps him become someone better, but my life was never waiting on him to see it. She paused. The old me needed him to say those words. The woman I am now doesn't need anyone to say them, because I already know exactly who I am. And that's the whole difference between the woman in the black dress and the woman on that stage tonight. Grace's eyes filled, and she nodded, and she put the phone away. That night, Victoria didn't go to the after-party where 100 important people wanted to shake her hand. She'd learned over 2 years the difference between the rooms that fed her and the rooms that only wanted a piece of her. Instead, she went home to the apartment she'd bought with her own money and her own name, and she made herself a cup of tea, and she stood at the window and looked out at the city. The same city she'd once watched from behind a husband who never saw her. The same city that now had her name carved in stone above a building full of people who believed in what she was building. She thought about the young woman who had walked down the aisle 2 lifetimes ago, believing she'd been chosen when she'd only been used. She thought about the invisible wife pouring wine at dinner parties, swallowing her own genius. She thought about the woman in the emerald gown taking the first terrifying step into the light. She thought about all the versions of herself she'd had to move through to arrive here at this window, in this quiet hole and unhidden and finally fully alive. And she understood standing there that her story had never really been about Alexander at all. It had never been about a cruel husband or a stolen fortune or a spectacular fall. Those were just the events. The real story, the one that mattered, was the oldest and simplest story in the world, and it belonged entirely to her. It was the story of the person who spent years waiting to be seen by someone else and who finally understood that the only pair of eyes that could ever truly free her were her own. She had waited 5 years for a man to look at her. She had spent 2 years learning to look at herself, and in the end, that was the only recognition that had ever mattered. Not the crowd's applause, not the billionaire's belief, not even her husband's too-late apology arriving from a prison cell. All of that was just noise. The only voice that had ever had the power to set her free was the one that had whispered on a night 2 years ago, in front of a mirror in an emerald gown, "There you are. I've missed you." Victoria Hayes finished her tea. She set the cup down, and she smiled at her own reflection in the darkened glass, at the woman who had finally permanently come home to herself. She had been the light the whole time. She had simply at last stopped waiting for someone else to notice, and no one would ever make her disappear again. But the story didn't end at that window with that cup of tea, though it would have been a beautiful place to end it. Because 3 weeks after the conference, something happened that Victoria hadn't planned for, something that would test whether she'd truly become the woman she believed she was, or whether she'd only learned to talk like her. It started with a phone call from Karen Voss, the attorney who had guided her through the darkest weeks of the Whitmore collapse 2 years earlier. "Victoria," Karen said, and there was a caution in her voice that Victoria had learned to recognize. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you react. Can you do that?" "You're scaring me, Karen." "There's a young woman," Karen said. "Her name is Emily Sato. She's 26. She reached out to my office yesterday and she asked to be put in touch with you, she says." Karen paused. "She says she's engaged to a man who reminds her exactly of the stories she read about your marriage. She says she's been reading everything about your case for a year, and she says she thinks she's about to make the same mistake you made, and she doesn't know how to stop, and she doesn't have anyone to ask." A pause. "She's not looking for money, Victoria. She's not a reporter. I checked. She's just a frightened young woman who thinks you might be the only person alive who understands what she's feeling." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. 2 years ago, this call would have terrified her. The idea of a stranger seeing her own story reflected back the idea of being responsible for someone else's crossroads. She would have deflected it, sent a polite message, kept her distance. But she wasn't that woman anymore. "Give her my number," Victoria said. "The direct one, not the office, mine." "Victoria, you don't have to." "Karen," Victoria said gently. 2 years ago, I stood at the very bottom of my own life, and the only reason I climbed out was that a man named Richard Blackwell crossed a ballroom and refused to let me disappear. He didn't have to do that. He didn't know me. He just saw someone drowning and decided to reach out his hand." She paused. "I've spent 2 years wondering how to pay that back. Maybe this is how. Give her my number." Emily Sato called that evening. Her voice was young and careful, and full of the particular exhaustion Victoria remembered so well, the exhaustion of a person who spends all their energy trying to be small enough not to upset someone. "Ms. Hayes," Emily said, "thank you for taking my call. I'm sorry, I don't even know where to start. I feel ridiculous. You're this incredibly successful woman and I'm just—" "Stop," Victoria said gently. "Right there. Do you hear what you just did? You just made yourself smaller before we'd even begun. You called yourself just this, just that." A pause. "I did that for years, Emily. Every sentence began with an apology for existing. So let's start there. You are not just anything. Now tell me what's happening. Tell me all of it. I'm listening. I'm really listening." And Emily told her. She told her about her fiancé, a charming, successful man who everyone adored, who was generous in public and cold in private. She told her about the way he'd slowly stopped asking her opinion, then stopped introducing her by name, then started correcting her in front of friends. She told her about the way she'd begun to shrink to second-guess herself, to feel grateful for scraps of attention. She told her about the wedding 3 months away and the growing terror in her chest that she was about to sign away the rest of her life to a man who didn't actually see her. "And the worst part," Emily said, her voice breaking, "is that when I try to explain it to people, they look at me like I'm crazy. They say he's wonderful. They say I'm lucky. They say, what could you possibly be unhappy about? And I start to think, maybe I am crazy. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm asking for too much." Victoria closed her eyes, and for a moment she was 28 again, standing in a penthouse kitchen, being told she wouldn't understand the business. "Emily," she said quietly, "listen to me very carefully because I'm going to tell you the thing I wish someone had told me 12 years ago." She took a breath. "You are not crazy. You are not asking for too much. Wanting to be seen by the person you're going to marry is not too much. It is the absolute minimum." Her voice was firm now. "A man who is wonderful in public and cold in private hasn't shown you two sides of himself. He's shown you exactly one. The public warmth is the performance. The private coldness is the truth. And you already know that or you wouldn't have found my phone number." Emily was crying now softly. "But everyone says—" "Everyone isn't marrying him," Victoria said. "Everyone doesn't have to wake up next to him for the next 40 years, slowly disappearing. You do. So everyone's opinion is worth exactly nothing here. The only opinion that matters is the one you're too frightened to trust, your own." There was a long silence on the line. "How did you finally leave?" Emily whispered. "I've read all the articles, but they never explain the part I actually need. How did you find the strength? What was the moment?" Victoria thought about it, really thought about it, because she owed this frightened young woman the truth, not a slogan. "There wasn't a single moment at first," Victoria said. "That's the thing no one tells you. For years I kept waiting for some final straw, some unforgivable act that would give me permission to go. And it never came, because he was never dramatically cruel. He was just quietly absent. And you can't point to quiet absence and show it to the world as a reason. So I stayed waiting for a reason big enough to justify leaving." She paused. "And then one day I realized I had it backwards. I was waiting for a reason to leave, but the truth was I'd never had a real reason to stay. I'd just been afraid. And fear is not a reason, Emily. Fear is just fear wearing the costume of a reason." "So what changed?" "I stopped asking whether he was bad enough to leave," Victoria said, "and I started asking whether this was the life I wanted to be living when I was 70, whether this was the story I wanted to tell about my one and only life. And the answer was no. It was so clearly, obviously no, that I couldn't believe I'd spent 5 years pretending it was a hard question." She paused. "You already know your answer, Emily. You've known it long enough that you tracked down a stranger's phone number. So the only question left is whether you're going to keep waiting for permission that no one is ever going to give you. Because I'll tell you a secret. No one is coming to give you permission to save your own life. You have to give it to yourself." Emily was silent for a long time, and when she spoke again, something had changed in her voice, something small but real. "I don't think I can marry him," she said, and it came out like a confession, like a thing she'd been holding underwater for months, finally allowed to surface. "I know," Victoria said gently. "You've known for a while. You just needed to hear it out loud in your own voice, and now you have." "I'm terrified. Of course you are, Victoria said warmly. Leaving is terrifying. Staying is also terrifying. You've just gotten used to that particular terror, so it feels like safety. It isn't. It's just familiar. She paused. But here's what I can promise you, Emily, because I lived it. Everything you're afraid you'll lose by leaving is nothing compared to what you'll find on the other side. And the main thing you'll find is yourself, the whole self, the one you've been hiding so carefully that you've almost forgotten she's in there. Her voice softened. She's in there, I promise you. And she's been waiting a very long time for you to come back for her. They talked for 2 hours that night, and in the weeks that followed, they talked many more times. Victoria connected Emily with Karen for practical advice, connected her with resources, connected her with a version of the future where she got to be a full human being. And she watched over those weeks, a frightened young woman slowly straighten her spine, slowly stop, apologizing for existing, slowly remember who she'd been before she'd started disappearing. Emily called off the wedding 2 months later, and the phone call she made to Victoria afterward was one Victoria would treasure for the rest of her life. I did it, Emily said, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. I did it. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I did it. And Victoria, I can breathe. For the first time in 2 years, I can actually breathe. I forgot what it felt like to just be myself in my own life. There she is, Victoria said softly, and her own eyes were wet. There she is. Welcome back, Emily. When Victoria hung up that call, she sat quietly for a long time. And she understood at last what her whole journey had been for. It hadn't been for the award, it hadn't been for the company, or the vindication, or even the freedom. Those things were wonderful, but they weren't the point. The point was Emily, and the 100 women like Emily who would find Victoria's story and see themselves in it. The point was that Victoria's 5 years of suffering hadn't been wasted because she'd been able to reach back through time into the dark place she'd once lived and pull another person out of it before they lost the years she'd lost. Her pain had become someone else's map. Her invisibility had become someone else's permission to be seen. And that Victoria realized was a kind of alchemy more valuable than anything in the luxury world she'd built her career on. The ability to take the worst thing that ever happened to you and turn it into the reason someone else survives. She began doing it on purpose after that. She started a foundation quietly at first that helped women recognize the slow, quiet erasure that doesn't leave bruises but destroys lives all the same. Not the dramatic kind of harm that makes headlines, but the invisible kind. The kind she'd lived. The kind where a person is slowly, gently, patiently made to disappear until they've forgotten they ever existed. She funded counselors, she funded legal aid, she funded a hotline, and she told her own story over and over in front of anyone who would listen because she'd learned that a story told in the open loses its power to shame you and gains the power to save someone else. Richard Blackwell watched her build this second thing, this thing that made no money at all, and one afternoon he came to her office and sat across from her and looked at her for a long time. "You know," he said finally, "when I offered to back you 2 years ago, I thought I was investing in a designer, the most talented one alive, but still, a designer." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. I wasn't investing in a designer. I was investing in exactly the kind of person my late wife was, the kind who takes what they've been given and turns it into something that helps other people breathe." His voice roughened. "She'd have loved you, Victoria. She'd have loved what you've become. And I think watching you, I've finally been able to forgive myself for all the years I spent too busy to tell her what she meant to me." He smiled sadly. "You've given me that. So thank you for being the person she always knew someone could be." Victoria came around the desk and hugged the old man, and neither of them said anything for a while because some things are too large for words. Alexander Whitmore was released from prison 4 years after his conviction. Victoria heard about it the way she heard most things about him now, secondhand from a distance with a kind of gentle detachment. He didn't reach out. There was nothing left to reach out about. He'd served his time, lost everything, and disappeared into the ordinary anonymity of a man who had once been a king and was now simply a person who had made terrible choices and paid for them. She hoped he was okay. She genuinely did. Not because she owed him anything, but because carrying hatred was a weight, and she'd put down every weight she could find. She hoped he'd learn to see. She hoped he'd become someone in his ordinary new life that the old Alexander would never have recognized. She hoped his apology from that prison cell had been the beginning of something real and not just the last performance of a man who'd run out of audience. But she didn't check. She didn't follow up. Because his story and her story had separated completely, and that separation was the healthiest thing she'd ever done. Her story kept going, and it kept getting bigger, and it kept helping more people breathe. And on a bright morning, many years later, an older Victoria Hayes stood once again at a window in an apartment in her own name, in a life she'd built brick by brick with her own hands, and she looked out at a city that had once tried to convince her she was nothing. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She had been the entire time exactly what she'd always been. A woman of extraordinary light standing quietly in the background, waiting for the day she'd finally give herself permission to shine. That day had come, and it had never left. She thought about the young Victoria in the plain black dress. She thought about the emerald gown and the ballroom and the moment she'd decided to be seen. She thought about Emily and the 100 women after Emily, each one a frightened person who'd found her way back to themselves. She thought about all of it, the whole long journey from invisible to unmistakable, and she felt nothing but gratitude, even for the hard parts, especially for the hard parts, because the hard parts had made her. And here is the truth. She had learned the truth she now spent her life giving away to anyone who needed it. The truth that had cost her 5 years to earn, and that she would have paid 10 times over to know. The quiet ones are not the powerless ones. The person standing silently in the background, the one everyone overlooks, the one told to wear the plain dress and stay out of the way, may be carrying the greatest strength in the entire room. Kindness is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. And the person the whole world ignores today may very well be the person the whole world remembers tomorrow. Victoria Hayes had been treated like nothing, and she had risen to become everything. Not by becoming cruel, not by seeking revenge, but by finally permanently refusing to disappear. She had walked into that gala as a wife told to stay silent. She had walked out as a woman who would never be silent again. And for the rest of her life, in every room she entered, in every life she touched, in every frightened person she reached back to save Victoria Hayes was seen. Fully, completely, forever. She had been the light the whole time. And she would never ever apologize for shining again.